requests are the positions that you are requesting funding for. In addition to those positions, you need to list the percentage of time that those individuals will be working on the grant or project, how much you're going to be compensating them for, their salary. We prefer that you show that as on an annual basis. Now, if your travel organization is currently paying cost of living increases, you definitely want to include that as well. And as always, when you're completing any category within your budget, all of your costs should be necessary to the performance of your project. They should be reasonable, they should be allowable, and allocable to your grant activities. Now, what you see here is actually a sample of the budget detail for the personnel category. And what you see here is request for a project director. You'll see their annual salary, their salary rate, how much time they're going to be working on a grant, the actual percentage of time, and the total cost requested for this individual. Now, if you go down to the second and third line, the same individual will be receiving a cost of living increase. As you can see, the salary hasn't increased on each line. So the salary increase or the cost of living increase, you will show that on each line separately. And one good thing about our budget detail workbook, it will automatically do the calculations for you once you enter your information. Now, in addition to the budget detail, you must include a budget narrative. The budget narrative should basically state the position you're requesting funding for and actually what they will be doing or performing in regards to the grant. You also want to include what their annual salary is and the rate of the cost of living increase you may be including. Bill's going to mention a few things in regards to the COPS program.
Thank you, Angela. And hello, I'm Bill Faith. I'm staff accountant, and I'll be providing comments specific to the Purpose Area 1, Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, better known as the COPS office. Under this purpose area only, applicants must have an established law enforcement agency that is operational as of February 28, 2017, which is the closing date of this application, or receive services through a new or existing contract for law enforcement services with the Bureau of Indian Affairs or a state or local agency. If you have any questions on whether you fit this criteria, you can go ahead and give us a call at our COPS Response Center, and you'll be directed to the correct person. That's 1-800-421-6770. You'll see that number throughout. I want to mention supplanting, because as we go through this, it's all about cost. And I just want to make sure that everybody's on board with this. Supplanting. Generally, DOJ funds must be used to supplement existing funds for program activities and may not replace, supplant, non-federal funds that have been appropriated for the same purpose. Grant funds must be used to increase the amount of state, local, tribal, or BIA funds that otherwise would be budgeted for these purposes in the absence of a DOJ award funding. For additional guidance regarding supplanting, including DOJ program-specific examples, refer to the Coordinated Tribal Assistance Solicitation Guidance regarding supplanting frequently asked questions at justice.gov/tribal. That page will also give you a list of resources that were listed on a slide several slides earlier, if you can use that for your resources. And Angela quickly touched on the narratives, and it's a very important topic. So I want to go through a section here for the narrative. The budget detail worksheet narrative and the demographic form are with 15% of your score. So it's important to get accurate and complete everything that we ask you to complete. The budget narrative should thoroughly and clearly describe every category of expense listed in the budget detail worksheet. DOJ expects proposed budgets to be complete, cost-effective, and allowable. As Angela said, reasonable, allocable, and necessary for project activities. The narrative should correspond with the information and figures provided in the budget detail worksheet. The narrative should also explain how all costs were estimated and how they are relevant to the completion of the proposed project. Applicants should demonstrate in their budget narratives how they will maximize cost effectiveness of grant expenditures. Budget narratives should generally describe cost effectiveness in relation to the potential alternatives and the goals of the project. For example, a budget narrative should detail why planned in-person meetings are necessary or how technology and collaboration with outside organizations could be used to reduce costs without compromising quality. The narrative should be mathematically sound and correspond with the information and figures provided in the budget detail worksheet of that category. The narrative should explain how the applicant estimated and calculated all costs and how they are relevant to the completion of the proposed project. The narrative may include tables for clarification purposes but need not be in a spreadsheet format. As with the budget detail worksheet, the budget narrative should be broken down by year. If an applicant proposes to make one or more non-competitive procurements of products or services where the non-competitive procurement will exceed the simplified acquisition threshold, also known as the small purchase threshold of $150,000, the budget narrative should address this consideration outlined in the DOJ Grants Financial Guide. For COPS Office applicants, if awarded, grantees should seek approval for the COPS Office for non-competitive procurements exceeding $150,000. Applicants are strongly encouraged to use the provided workbook with the demographic form, detail worksheet, and budget narrative, but it is not required. An applicant that chooses to use a different format should ensure that all budget and demographic information requested in the provided workbook is included. Find budget detail worksheet and demographics form at grants.ojb.usdoj.gov/CTAS. To begin with hiring, in the personnel category, you see an example of the COPS office category. It's a little bit different from the rest of the purpose areas in that we're looking for specific information. For hiring, eligibility. Applicants must have an established law enforcement agency that is operational as of February 28th, which is the close of the solicitation, or receive services through a new or existing contract for law enforcement services with the Bureau of Indian Affairs or a state or local agency. A career law enforcement officer is authorized by law or by a state, local, or tribal agency to engage in or oversee the prevention, detection, or investigation of violations of criminal laws. Approved entry-level salaries and fringe benefits of newly hired or rehired full-time sworn career law enforcement officers, including village public safety officers and background investigations for newly hired positions. These are entry-level, so you must remember that. Positions may be requested specifically to address methamphetamine issues within the tribe. All newly hired, additional, or rehired officers, or an equal number of redeployed veteran officers funded under Purpose Area Number 1 must engage in community policing activity. You also have the option to begin the grant period for an officer that you have hired and put into the police academy, if that is your agency's process. The Purpose Area Number 1 budget worksheet will assist your law enforcement agency in reporting your agency's current entry-level salary and benefits and identifying the total salary and benefits request per officer for the length of the grant term. For Purpose Area 1, that would be 3 years. List the current entry-level base salary and fringe benefits rounded to the nearest whole dollar for one full-time sworn officer position within your agency. Do not include the employee contributions. We'll touch on that when we get to the fringe benefits section. A special note on the fringe benefits: for agencies that do not include fringe benefits as part of the base salary costs and typically calculate these separately, the allowable expenditures may be included under Section B, Fringe Benefits. Any fringe benefits that are already included as part of the agency's base salary, Section A, should not also be included in separate fringe listing, Section B. For more information about allowable and unallowable fringe benefits and also costs for other categories, please see the allowable and unallowable cost list that we have put together. You can find that at justice.gov/tribal. Civilian officer, when a civilian position, the only one allowed will be as salaries and fringe benefits for a methamphetamine coordinator. The retention policy: applicants requesting funding for hiring must plan to retain grant-hired officers for 12 months after the expiration of the grant. That means after the 36 months have been completed, the officer must be in place. If there's a vacancy, that 36-month period would be extended. You would need to ask for an extension at that point. For the methamphetamine coordinator, you do not have a requirement for retention. If we move to the fringe benefits category.
Okay, for fringe benefits. What we're looking for when you're completing your budget for fringe benefits, the first thing, we need to make sure that when you're paying fringe benefits, that you're only paying fringe benefits for those individuals that are listed in your personnel category. So what is included with fringe benefits? What we're looking for in fringe benefits are health insurance benefits that you're paying, FICA, retirement, and generally workman's compensation. Now for your fringe benefits detail, what you want to do is you want to list each fringe benefit category separately, along with the base and the rate that you're charging against the fringe benefit. The base is generally going to be the salary that you were requesting funding for from the personnel category. But in this example here, you see a listing for FICA. You see the base, which was the annual salary from the previous personnel slide, and the rate they're charging for FICA. The next line item down, again, you'll see workman's comp and unemployment insurance, followed by retirement and then health insurance. Now for the narrative here, you want to list a breakdown of the percentage you're paying for each fringe benefit category and how you came up with that fringe benefit rate. Maybe it's consistent with what your tribe normally pays out as fringe benefits. And again, your narrative, as Bill mentioned, should relate to what you're calculating in your budget detail. Bill?
Thank you, Angela. Okay, so as we see, COPS office has a slightly different category chart that we're going to fill out. There are 9 categories, 9 items listed as specific on the category for the memo. If you could go to the next slide, and I'll read over those on my paper. In the previous Category A personnel, you notice that we asked for the salary for each year. That would be the approved entry-level salary that you've agreed to, and any in year 2 or 3 with any good faith estimates, historical estimates as an increase to year 1 and year 2 salaries. Obviously, it's going to be an estimate. We don't know what the future holds, but if you have an approved entry-level salary, that's a good place to start in year 1. In the fringe benefits category, what you're going to have is separate line items. So as the line items apply to you, you will enter the amounts for years 1, year 2, and year 3 as they apply to the salary for that year in the previous category. We'll calculate that automatically and give you a percentage. What we're looking for is the agency portion of contributions. Remember, I told you don't include the employee contributions. We're looking for gross salary and the benefits associated to that. Also, overtime is unallowed. It's not allowed in this category, so don't include any benefits applied to any overtime. Based on actual costs, so these are actual costs that you are giving to any other employee that you have in the agency. They can't be made up at that point that you're putting this together. They have to be approved prior to the application. They can be from an approved negotiated indirect cost rate, but we need that actual current indirect cost rate agreement. Costs can increase, and if you have a historical pattern on your increases, you can use that. If you have good faith estimate, you can use that. If you want to use that, the narrative field to describe how you came up with year 2 and 3, that would be a good place to start. And of course, the narrative field should have a salary and benefit description for both sections, what it is that you're asking and how it relates to the salary and the benefits that the officer is going to provide. I mentioned overtime is unallowable, so that wouldn't be on here. And the other, there's one line for the other category. If you have more than one item that needs to go on here in the other category, you lump them together on that one line for each year, and then you separate them in the narratives column and let us know what is in the other line item. In order for us to determine whether that's an accurate statement, we need to see the description behind that. Angela?
Thank you, Bill. The next category is the travel category. Now keep in mind, there is a travel requirement for each one of the purpose areas. So you want to make sure that you consult the solicitation for each one of your purpose areas for the particular requirements. And you want to make sure you do that before you're completing the travel section of the budget, because they do have particular details on how they would like you to calculate or estimate your travel in this category. Now for the travel category, you need to let us know whether or not you're using your own organization's travel policy or if you're using the federal government's travel policy. If your organization does not have their own travel policy in place, then you must follow the federal policy. What we're looking for here is the computation. We want to know the number of people from your organization that are traveling and the cost of their travel. We want to know why they're traveling, what's the purpose for the travel, is it mandatory travel, is it required for the grant. You also need to state what your organization's per diem policy is. You also need to list your transportation costs. Now when you're listing transportation costs, you need to make sure you're listing any airfare, taxi, shuttle bus service separately. Also keep in mind, if you're requesting airfare travel within this category, please make sure you include the cost of baggage fees. In addition to transportation, you want to also make sure you include any cost for any parking or tolls. If you are utilizing local travel, please state what your organization's local travel policy is and what the mileage rates are. Again, I can't say this enough. If your organization does not have a policy in place, then you must follow the federal policy. So for this detail here in this example, you can see it has a separate line item for local travel. And then the next line item shows mandatory travel as part of the program, where you're traveling to. It has a separate line item for any airfare, lodging, and a listing of the per diem rates. And again, with all the budget categories, you're required to include a budget narrative. So this example here actually shows an explanation of the calculations listed in the budget detail. It has a breakdown of the lodging, how many people are traveling, the number of nights they will be traveling for, the airfare, the per diem rate, and it also has a statement listing that this particular travel is required per the particular purpose area they're requesting funding for. Also, you want to keep in mind that if you are hosting an event using OJP, I have to check with Bill whether this applies to COPS as well. Any OJP funded contracts for events that you're hosting that has 30 or more participants, now whether these participants need lodging or not, but if they're attending your event, then you're required to use the federal rate for lodging and per diem. Now, if you're hosting an event with less than 30 people, then you are exempt from this requirement.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. And does not apply to the COPS office.
Okay, thank you. If you want to know what the federal travel policy is, it is listed on the www.gsa.gov website, and also you could consult with the DOJ financial guide. So you have some additional information for COPS?
Yes, I do. On this slide, you'll see a few points that I'll be discussing. So if we can move to the second slide, and we'll see the chart. Category C, you can tell that the travel and training category is slightly different than the rest of the purpose areas. What we have is a combination on one line. Law enforcement training such as basic and comprehensive or specialized training at a state academy or the Indian Police Academy in Artesia, New Mexico, as well as community policing, computer and crime reporting training, also to include anti-methamphetamine training. Some of the classes that I could list as approved. The allowable cost list is there for you. It has a few extra that are listed. If you're concerned about whether your request is going to be allowed or not, you can give us a call, or you can just simply put it on the budget and see how it comes out in the end. Travel, looking for airfare, lodging, and mileage reimbursement for meeting or training costs related to purpose area activities, including costs associated with any DOJ-required training and anti-methamphetamine training. Your training request should include the estimated cost for travel and accommodations for at least 2 staff members to attend 1 meeting in Washington, D.C. for the required CTAS training orientation. Generally, what we ask is that we're not sure when or where an orientation is going to take place. So if you can pick a city that could possibly hold it, which is the farthest away from you, and price it out like that, so that if it happens to be you're in the West Coast and you have to come to Washington, you will already have benefited by taking advantage of asking for the travel for going across country. So keep that in mind. The categories are listed out as registration, transportation, lodging, and per diem. If you have a grouping, say under the transportation, such as you would have the airfare and the baggage costs, you could add the total there, and you would let us know in the description field, in the narrative field, how you broke that down, and we can come out and confirm your calculations at that point. Okay, thank you, Angela.
Thank you, Bill. The next category is the equipment category. I know I keep talking about policy, but having a policy is very important. So for equipment, you need to let us know what your organization's policy for capitalization for equipment. And again, if you don't have a policy for your organization, you need to follow the federal policy. And I will give you guidelines on the federal policy momentarily. So what we're looking for in equipment, we want to see what you're purchasing, how much it costs, and how this equipment will be used to support your program. So for the federal policy for equipment says equipment should have a useful life of more than 1 year with a fair market value of $5,000 or more. Now, if you have bought equipment under the federal policy with federal funds and you no longer need that equipment for your grant or for any kind of criminal justice purposes, then if the equipment, the fair market value of the equipment is less than $5,000, you can actually keep the equipment with no further obligation back to the awarding agency. Now, in that same scenario, if the fair market value of the equipment is $5,000 or more, the equipment may be retained or sold. However, if you do sell the equipment, the proceeds from selling the equipment must be returned to the awarding agency. Now, for the budget detail for the equipment, you need to list the equipment that you're actually purchasing, the number of items that you're purchasing, and the actual cost. Now, down in the narrative, you need to, again, state what you're purchasing, the equipment you're purchasing, how it's going to be used to support your program or your grant, and you also need to state out what your organization's policy for capitalizing equipment. Bill.
You can go back to
Okay.
the chart. Okay. Just a few quick notes here on the equipment for the COPS office. As Angela mentioned, you have our desires for you to let us know if you have a capitalization policy or if you're using a federal share, and you let us know. You put that out in the writing in the narrative section to let us know how you're coming up with these costs. And I just wanted to go over a few items that are more common to the COPS office. Law enforcement equipment. Uniforms, bulletproof vests, basic issue equipment and police vehicles such as police cars, SUVs, ATVs, and boats as needed for law enforcement purposes to include anti-methamphetamine activities. Technology such as computer hardware and software, mobile data terminals, narrowband radio upgrades, and dispatch and communication systems. Applicants that do not already have an information gathering system compatible with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, Uniform Crime Reporting System are encouraged to apply for funds to pay for National Incident-Based Reporting System, UCR compliant crime data systems. Applicants can also request hardware and software required to access national criminal justice related databases, for example, National Crime Information Center, and explain how the equipment is necessary for the success of the project, describe the procurement method to be used in the budget narrative field. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you, Bill. Now, the next category is the supplies category. Now, with supplies, those are generally the items that you will be expensing during a year. It's also any equipment that does not fall within the thresholds of your capitalization policy. So what you want to do here is you want to list the supplies that you will be purchasing or requesting to purchase, how the supplies will be used to support your grant or your program, and you also want to make sure you include a detailed explanation of the supplies within your budget narrative. So in this example here in the budget detail, you see a list of line items for each different type of supply that's being purchased. Now, when we talk about office supplies, we don't want you to list out every single different office supplies. You can actually group office supplies together in one group. So you want to list each office supply item, how much you're purchasing, and the cost of it. And down in the narrative, you want to include what you're using those supplies for and how much they're going to cost and how it supports your program. The next category is the construction category. The construction category is generally used for Purpose Area 4. It doesn't actually include construction, as Purpose Area 4 is allowing for renovations of a new or existing facility. So there will be no new construction within this area. So for construction, if we're talking about renovating a certain area or space, you want to include the amount of space that you're requesting funding for, the basis of it. In this example here, you see it's a 1,200 square foot area at a $22 per square foot. If it's a particular item or equipment that's part of construction, you want to include what the item is and the actual cost of the item. And you also want to list what the purpose of the renovation that you are requesting funding for. This is just an example of the budget detail for construction. You'll see here it has a line item for square footage, the basis, and how much it actually costs. It has another line item for a security camera and another line item for fencing, the number of items and actually how much it costs. In the narrative, it actually explains what the renovations are for, what is actually being done, and how much it actually costs. The next category, sub-grants, procurement, should I say sub-awards, sub-grants, and procurement. Now, DOJ has designated this budget category to enable applicants to identify proposed costs for sub-awards and to distinguish these costs from costs for procurement contracts that the applicant proposes to fund with federal funds. Now, if you need to see a definition for sub-award, you can consult the 2 CFR 200.92, or for contracts, the definition is at 2 CFR 200.22. Now, for next year, there will probably be a totally separate line item for you to be able to identify a contract. So look forward for that for the next fiscal year. So for FY17 CTAS, make sure if you have sub-awards under CTAS that you're listing them separately from contracts. There is a category that will allow you to enter subawards separately. So for this category, you're going to list your subawards and how much you're going to be paying. If you are using the procurement process, you want to make sure that your procurement process is open, free, and fair. If you have any questions over the procurement process, you can consult the Uniform Guidance or the DOJ Financial Guide. If you're using consultants, keep in mind the consultant rate is $650 threshold for an 8-hour workday. This goes for all the purpose areas. If you are using a sole source, please keep in mind that if you have a sole source contract that's over $150,000, you do need to submit a justification for using that sole source. And that justification does need to be included when you're submitting this budget. This is just an example of the budget detail. You will see here there is a line item for procurement and consultant. I apologize, what you don't see here is we don't have the separate line item showing for subawards, but there is a drop down. Once you do go into the budget detail workbook, there is a separate drop down. You can choose to enter your subawards or subgrants. And again, if you're looking for the definition for a subaward or contract, I know sometimes it can be confusing. Please consult the Uniform Guidance or the 2 CFR 200. Also make sure with your budget details that you are including the budget narrative. You're explaining what type you're using, if it's a subaward, a contract, or sole source, that you're explaining how much it's going to cost and what this contract or subgrant, whatever it is that you're requesting funding for, how it's going to support your program or your grant. The next category is the other category. Usually in the other category, you will see items here such as if you have a building that you're renting or leasing, any utility costs, etc. The example we have here is background investigations. So for the budget detail, you need to list what you are requesting funding for in the other category, how much it costs, if it's utilities, the basis for calculating the utilities. If it's, for example, sometimes cell phones may go under here, you want to put down how much it's going to cost in the time period. And in the narrative, you want to include what you're requesting funding for these other items for, and how it's going to support the program. Last but not least is the indirect cost category. Now, if you would like to request funding in the indirect cost category, you need to either have an approved indirect cost rate agreement by your federal cognizant agency. Again, it needs to be the current negotiated rate, provisional, final, or predetermined. If you have never had an indirect cost rate agreement or federally approved indirect cost rate agreement, you may elect to use the de minimis rate. Again, I'm going to repeat that again. If you've never had a federally approved indirect cost rate agreement, you may elect to use the de minimis rate. The de minimis rate came about in the Uniform Guidance or the Circular 200. It will allow you to charge up to 10% of modified total direct cost without negotiating an indirect cost rate. The de minimis rate may be used indefinitely until you decide you want to negotiate for indirect cost rate with your federally cognizant agency. And you must make sure that if you're using the de minimis rate, that you are charging indirect costs consistently. And when we talk about consistently, we mean you can't charge one cost as a direct cost of one award and then charge it as an indirect on the next one. So you need to make sure that if you're electing to use the de minimis rate, that you state that in the budget when you're submitting that. So the budget detail, what we're looking for here is what type of indirect cost you're using, if you're using a federally approved indirect cost rate or the de minimis rate. We want to know what your base is with the actual rate you're going to be using. And we also need to know who your federally cognizant agency is. We need to know what your actual rate is, the basis of your rate, and the actual date that your indirect cost rate is effective for.
Thank you, Angela. And we agree on every point that she has brought up. You must have the approved indirect cost rate agreement. It must be current. There is in the frequently asked questions section specific to this, and it asks what happens if we don't have a current federal rate, approved rate. Well, technically, you shouldn't be allowed to, but we're allowing you to have the indirect cost pushed into or approved for the award. You just won't be able to draw down any of those funds that are listed for the indirect cost until you submit a current indirect cost for the time period that you're incurring those expenses. So you can submit the report, the application, with your most recent indirect cost rate agreement. If it happens to have been expired when you submit the report or the application, then the funds will be approved if you are awarded, and it will be placed on hold until a current federal agreement signed and negotiated has been delivered to the office, and that way for the time period that you're incurring these expenses. So every time that you have an indirect cost rate agreement that becomes expired, the funds will be frozen for the expenses that will be incurred beyond that date until you submit an agreement to cover that date. What the COPS office would like to know in terms of the base, the direct cost basis, how did you come up with it? What was your type? First, what was the rate, and then what was the type of your indirect cost to come up with the total that you've given us in category I? A lot of times we're finding out that everybody is just incurring, listing the base as the rest of the costs for the grant that you are applying for. And not all the time that is correct. So if you're asking for vehicles, an SUV or a boat, you're probably not going to want to include that boat in the indirect cost base. So be careful about what you put in the base, make sure that you're doing that correctly, and then identify that in the narrative field. If you could put in the items, if it's an entire category, put in the entire, say it's the entire category for other or the entire category for supplies. But make sure that you leave out the items that are not going to be, that are going to be capitalized and not included in the base for this particular grant. You're only allowed to have indirect costs associated with the items that are going to be put in the base. So, and then explain it in the budget narrative details. Angela?
And again, as Bill mentioned, when you're including costs for the indirect cost category, please make sure you do include a copy of your indirect cost rate agreement if you have one. Then once you've completed your budget, the budget workbook will automatically create a budget summary for each budget category and for each purpose area that you're requesting funding for. So you will be able to see a total of everything that you're requesting once you complete the workbook. Now, one of our goals is as I mentioned at the beginning, is to make sure you produce a high-quality budget. We want you to be able to submit your budget, to go through the application process, and to get your budget approved as soon as possible. So please make sure that you're reading the solicitation, you know all the rules and requirements before you submit everything, because a lot of reasons why it takes so long is because there are things missing from your budget or things you forgot to include or maybe things you included that you should not have included. So keep in mind when you're submitting your budget that you haven't included any costs that are unallowable, that you are actually very clear when you're writing out your narrative. One thing I always like to suggest that once you finish your budget, that you have someone else within your organization actually kind of review it to make sure that it actually makes sense to them And also keep a checklist to make sure that you have not left anything out. Again, we also already mentioned to make sure that if you're requesting indirect costs, that you include a copy of your indirect cost rate agreement. If your purpose area allows you to provide match, make sure that you're providing a source of how you're going to meet that match requirement. And again, like I said, make sure that you're reading all the rules and requirements. I mentioned earlier, the travel category is one good item that each purpose area does have detailed requirements on how they would like you to complete that budget section. So make sure you're reading everything, that you're reading and understanding, and it's clear to you before you submit your budget. Anything you would like to add, Bill?
No, I believe I've run out of things to say.
This actually concludes our overview. We will open up the floor for questions now.
Please go ahead and type any questions that you might have in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen.
I have a question. I'm confused on how this fringe benefits category differentiates from the previous slide. I think something was said about employer portion.
Right, so when you give the salary, that's your gross salary for the year for the employer or employee. That salary should include all of the contributions that are going to be taken out of the employee's salary portion to pay their share of Social Security and retirement and whatever else they have to pay as the employee. So don't take that into consideration when you're putting together your fringe benefits page. Only include the amount that the agency is going to contribute on top of the gross salary that you're paying the officer.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Kasha, I believe that's how you pronounce it. Sorry if it's not correct. On the previous slide, what does the number 3 in the duration distance column refer to?
In travel? Is that the travel section? Duration and distance. All right. So it depends on the category, the item that you're checking off. So if it's airfare, you're in 3 flights. 3 people are going to that, right? So if you listed airfare, and you listed the number 3, that would generally mean 3 people are traveling. It depends on the item that you put to the left of that, what the number is representing. So if you have a lodging, and you say it's $200, you're going to say, I want, what did you put for lodging in this one? 9. So
The total number of nights, the lodging would be the total number of nights that you're requesting.
So it's all
right
dependent
there,
upon
for all the
item.
travelers.
Okay, thank you. Another question. If an application is approved using an expired indirect cost rate, will all funds be held until the updated rate is submitted? Or,
Only, okay.
sorry, or indirect cost funds only?
Okay. You hit it right there at the end. So only the indirect cost portion of that application will be held.
Okay. Monica asked, the tribe is the applicant. Is the indirect cost rate we utilize? We have our own IDC rate. Do we use this?
What she would have to do is just give us a call and discuss that. We need to see what exactly the specifics of her question.
And actually, you could also email the questions to tribalgrants@usdoj.gov. So any questions that we need to follow up on, please email tribalgrants@usdoj.gov. Thank you.
Teresa Peterson asked, can you just quickly list the expenses allowed to be included in base amount to determine indirect cost?
And there again is up to you. You're determining, the agency is determining which items you're going to capitalize and which items you're going to expense. And so based on the agreement that you've been awarded, if it's fixed carry forward like the one I'm looking at right now, you're going to exclude the capital items and the pass-through and the subcontracts. So those are the items you would not include. Everything else in the award that you have asked for would be a direct item. Running out of power. So then you would simply take all of the rest of those items and add them to, and could come up with the base. But what we're asking is that if everything in the supplies category is going to be included in the base, could you say that? Could you explain how the base is created by saying all items in supply category, all items in travel category?
Okay, we have a couple more minutes to take additional questions. Just please type them in the Q&A box. Betty Oppenheimer asked, what happens if my actual costs do not match my budget numbers?
Well, your budget is an estimate. So if you have a cost savings, then that's what's going to end up happening, whether it costs you more or it costs you less. That's the reality at the end of the grant life. So we won't know if that happens until the very end. If you ask, if it costs you more, you're going to run out of money because we can't allow an increase in funds. If it costs you less, then you'll have a cost savings, and you might be able to reallocate that to something else, and you can buy something else.
Okay, and Kara asked, Karen, sorry, didn't quite catch that. Did you say cannot supplant federal funds or cannot supplant non-federal funds?
All right. Generally, DOJ funds must be used to supplement existing funds for program activities and may not replace non-federal funds that have been appropriated for the same purpose. Does that help?
Yeah. We have about 30 more seconds to take one more question. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. You will be receiving a survey link that will help you in providing feedback so we can better serve you next year during the next webinar. Everybody will be receiving that who registered today. Please, please, please fill it out and let us know how we can better assist you. Thank you. Happy holidays.